So, welcome to another session from socialstudies.com, and that's home of our new website and also our new blog. We'd love for you guys to check that out at socialstudies.com. Tonight, we're meeting with Dale Fleury. We're delighted to have Dale with us. I'd like to just share a little bit of information about Dale with you. He is the Social Studies Content Director for A+ College Ready. And he's responsible for scaling and implementing teacher training and student incentive programs in social studies, grades 6 through 10, in the state of Alabama. I met Dale a few years ago, and I was really impressed with the work he's doing here. He brings 25 years of experience of social studies curriculum writing and instruction to us tonight. He's co-authored 2 books on the topic in social studies education. And prior to coming to us here in Alabama as the A+ College Ready Director, Dale served for 9 years as a Vice President of Programs and Business Development for a nationwide education nonprofit. So he just brings a host of experience to us tonight. And I was in his earlier session today. You're going to be really pleased with the things you see. Very practical, very real, and things that all of us can do to help students prepare for AP, and not only AP, but just be good teaching. So Dale, with that said, I appreciate you being here tonight. Appreciate our guest being online, and I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just razzle dazzle us for a little bit.
Okay. Thank you, Pam. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome to all of you. I'm glad that you could join us this evening for what I think will be a pretty practical application of the topic. It's a pretty broad topic, helping students prep for AP, but I approached it from the perspective of what we're trying to do in the state of Alabama and what we've done elsewhere as it applies to rigor and getting kids ready to take an advanced placement course. As Pam mentioned, we're a nonprofit, and we are scaling a social studies program that has several components to it. One of the components is teacher training for grades 6 through 10 that focuses on injecting rigor into the classroom. And the second element of our program is an advanced placement incentive program for students and teachers. So the two kind of go hand in hand, because what we're trying to do is to get more students exposed to rigorous education in the social studies. We want them to take more advanced placement courses, do better on the national exams in AP. There's a lot of data and research that's out there that shows the value of an AP education and an AP course. As a matter of fact, some people argue that success in an AP program is a better indicator of success post-secondary than the ACT and SAT, but I'll let the experts argue that. But I'm a big proponent of having as many students as possible experience an AP course, because there are definite advantages to it, and the research and data is out there to support that. But one of the things that we run into in this topic about advanced placement and making sure that students are ready is you talk to a lot of AP teachers about the students that come to them, and if they could rule the world or change things or decide what to do to help these students get ready, what would it be? And I think everyone is probably aware that what they're looking for is not so much content knowledge, although that's helpful, but they're looking for those higher level critical thinking skills that will help students dig deeper into that AP content. They're looking for students who can look at things from various perspectives, who are able to contextualize content, who are able to reflect different points of view to support evidence and provide evidence from primary and secondary sources. And unfortunately, a lot of the programs that feed into the advanced placement program do not spend enough time doing that. And so what we try to do in our program is we try to expose as many kids to bits and pieces of that critical thinking that will enable them to be successful and be prepared to be successful in an AP program. An advanced placement program at a particular school is only going to grow and expand if the lower levels that feed into it, the lower grade levels, have a solid pipeline of students who are well equipped and well prepared to take that course. Otherwise, you're going to see AP classrooms that are going to continually be the same size, continue to have roughly to maybe the top 10, top 20% of the student in the class in that program. In other words, there's really not a lot of room for expansion in the advanced placement course. And our philosophy is that all students can learn, and that all students who have any kind of post-secondary aspirations, whether it be a voc school or tech school or a four-year university, need to experience that rigorous advanced placement course. And as well, that they need to experience rigor in getting to those courses in the lower grades. So our program, grades 6 through 10, is built around that kind of philosophy. And so what I'd like to do with everybody this evening is kind of take you through what our program looks like and how we help students get ready for AP by giving you some practical examples that you can take back and use in your classroom tomorrow, and also kind of an overview, a philosophy, a model, if you will, of just exactly how you can do this. And it's as the title indicates, it's something that we have to do. It's extremely important, and it's not that hard to implement if you're willing to make a few changes. So I'd like to take you through that, and so the next series of slides is some concepts and definitions regarding this term that we now use a great deal of in education called rigor. And I want to talk about that just a little bit because obviously AP courses are rigorous. So we want the courses that feed into an AP program for all students to be rigorous as well. And so we need to kind of have a working definition. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just so that we have a common foundation to work from. And so here are some definitions of rigor and some explanations and characteristics of it. And the first one here is basically focusing on the concept of challenging work. And we want to make sure that a rigorous classroom is challenging students, and every student has an opportunity to push themselves, if you will, to the limit. The next definition here is, of course, we have challenging, but then another thing here is getting students to think about things in a different way and challenge them to think about things in a different way from different perspectives, using a variety of strategies and a variety of methods. The more that you do that, the more that their curiosity is going to be piqued, and the more that they're going to be engaged and willing to be more active in the classroom and benefit from the social studies discipline. So we've got challenging, and we've got thinking in different ways or in a variety of ways. The next one is just basically related to who should experience rigor, and our philosophy has always been anybody and everybody. As a matter of fact, a lot of the strategies that we use in our program where we inject the rigor at the lower levels actually comes from strategies that are used to work with kids who are at risk in terms of reading level and various academic abilities. So we believe that all students should be exposed to rigor. I always use the phrase that we have to play with the cards that we're dealt with, and so we don't get to pick and choose our students, and we have a responsibility to our communities and to our schools and to the parents of students that our children are going to be successful, if they are going to succeed. And so this is a big part of our philosophy in when we implement the strategies that we use. And so here's some characteristics of what a rigorous classroom would look like. And I want to mention this because there are some kind of exact opposites that if you look at these terms, perhaps you've been experienced some of these classrooms that when you were in school or in your post-secondary schools or universities. But for us, these are 5 very, very important characteristics or traits that every single one of the strategies that we employ to get kids ready to use AP is based on this. So number 1, problem-based. All of our strategies focus on some type of a problem issue that students have to work out and figure out using critical thinking skills. The other thing that this is student-centered, and so we employ a variety of methods, activities, strategies for the students whereby they discover, they look at the information. And the third one, they interact with each other. I guess it'd be 3 and 4. It's very active learning, and you're not going to see in one of our classrooms students sitting in rows, taking notes, looking at overheads, listening to a teacher lecture. That's not to say that from time to time information must be disseminated that way, but about 90% of our time our students are actively engaged, and the teachers being the facilitator, and the students are actively engaged with each other. There's some research out there that I think is very important to support that, and that is that students retain 90% of the information that they teach themselves or each other, and they only retain about 10% of the information that we as teachers teach them. So teachers who are used to the lecture delivery style should understand that they're not reaching too many students that way and with that method. And so we encourage teachers to adapt these characteristics and these traits. And obviously the last one is using higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, or what is called the depth of knowledge scale, which are similar. But again, it's engaging students in those higher level critical thinking skills. Now, in terms of what it means for a teacher, and this is a whole nother topic, but you can't just walk into a class tomorrow and say, okay, I'm going to turn my classroom into a rigorous classroom. It may be one already, but obviously this takes a lot of preparation and practice and time, just like anything that is quality and excellent and has excellence in it. You have to continually prepare, you have to continually analyze, do action research, practice to perfect it and make it even better. There is going to be times where teachers will stumble with some of these strategies and activities, but they can tweak them and they can readjust. You have to have the proper classroom environment. So there has to be a classroom environment in which active learning, collaboration, critical thinking is encouraged and is welcome. So this has a lot to do with how your classroom is set up and what kind of instruction and how it's delivered. And then, of course, lastly, the proper classroom management techniques. One of the things, just as simple as this, is a lot of teachers don't know how to divide students into manageable groups where they can work on a rigorous activity without wasting a lot of class time and valuable class time. So rather than waste that class time, they decide that, well, I'll just give the instruction myself. In all of our trainings, we do sessions on creating the proper classroom environment, and also providing what management techniques need to be introduced and need to be used by the teacher for that. So this is where I'm coming from when we talk about rigor and what it means, and how we implement it, or how we hope to implement it into our classrooms. This next slide is just kind of a thing about the reality. Again, I want to be practical as I can about what's out there regarding rigor in the classroom and getting students ready for advanced placement and so on. There's plenty of research regarding the implementation of rigor and things that can be done to help students get ready for advanced classes. There's lots of models of implementation that exist out there as well. Unfortunately, though, there's not a lot of professional development opportunities that reach large numbers. That's not to say there aren't professional development opportunities, but you know, as a teacher, if I really want a rigorous classroom, you know, I need to be able to attend a professional development that lasts several days and then has follow-up in which I can see whether or not I'm making the progress that is necessary. There just aren't a lot of those that are out there. Our program is one of those. And then the other thing, the resources and support that go along with that implementation and that professional development, there aren't very many as well. Now, I don't want to say, and again, that's not to say that there aren't resources that we can use for social studies education. There is a ton of resources out there. But what I'm saying is the kind of resources and materials and supports that needed to make sure that formatively and summatively rigor is occurring in your classroom. So, you know, I guess 2 pluses and 2 minuses, but that's kind of the way we are, where we are at right now. And what we're trying to do, obviously, is to increase that opportunity for teachers to build that pipeline and sustain more growth in advanced placement programs. So with that being said, what I'd like to do now is move into what I call our model to produce rigor and what it consists of. And I'd like to use the quote from Winston Churchill, who back in the 1940s was asking the United States for help and support, actually in the late 30s, early 40s, to fight the Nazis in Europe. And basically he issued a statement to Churchill and Americans saying, give us the tools and we'll finish the job. Well, basically that's what we want to do as teachers. We want to provide students with the tools that they need to be successful, and the students will finish the job. And with that in mind, what we then emphasize that every day, teachers of social studies, no matter what the topic is, no matter what the discipline is, and of course, social studies varies from from history to geography to psychology to economics. There's a lot of disciplines. Actually, the advanced placement exam, there are 9 advanced placement social studies courses that the College Board offers. So it's varied. And so what we're saying is, regardless of what that discipline is, when you are instructing students, in other words, when they are engaged in instruction, that you should use these 3 skill sets and 3 series of activities each instructional period. And this is where this is the kind of practicality of this. If you keep this in mind and think about it, tomorrow when you walk into your classroom and you're doing that lesson on whatever it may be, if you think about this in that context, you'll find that you can introduce rigor into your classroom almost immediately. The rate of success will come eventually, but if you continue to do that, you'll find that your classes become more, students become more engaged, they become more interested in the topic, and they like doing the work. So let's take a look at what these 3 skill sets and 3 series of activities involve. And again, given the fact that we have limited time, I'm not able to go through every single skill set, but I want to kind of give you a big picture and an idea, and I think you'll understand that, and then back that up with some specific examples that you'll be able to take back into your classroom tomorrow. So here's what we call our 3-step rigor model. We believe that if you employ and integrate every day content acquisition and content application and content exposition, you will have rigor going on in your classroom, and you don't really have to worry about whether or not the students are doing what they need to do or excelling. By following this 3-step model, it will happen. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. There's going to take practice and preparation, but I think it's easier. It's easy to do and implement if you just kind of focus on these 3 pieces. So let's take a look at what each of these pieces mean, and then I'll follow up with some specific strategies and examples that we use in our program to support to show what I mean. So content acquisition strategies. In social studies, the first thing that we always want students to do, and I hope that we want them to do that, is we want them to acquire information, acquire content. And so these are strategies or activities, if you will, that focus on, of course, improving our reading, and focus on analyzing documents, either primary or secondary resources, understanding new vocabulary, new themes, and that's really, really big in the social studies area. Understanding and being able to utilize vocabulary in the social studies is a major responsibility that we as social studies teachers have. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of us spend that much time on it, as you'll see in a minute. We also want our kids to be able to understand and tear apart charts, graphs, tables, maps, political cartoons, and that's a very difficult thing to do. And then finally, we're asking them to look for information in reliable technological resources. Obviously, looking on the internet for reliable information, reliable resources. Other areas where technology can be used and utilized to understand what something means and to acquire that information. But my point here is we don't do this in a vacuum. I don't see us, and we should not, hand out a primary source document, and let's say it's the Mayflower Compact, and we have the students look at it and read it, and then we go, there we go. We've just analyzed a primary source document without having to do something else with it. And that's why I think a lot of social studies teachers, they fall short on this, in this area. We have students go home and read the chapter. Why? Because there's going to be a quiz on it tomorrow. We want students to go to the back of the book and look in the glossary and write down the definitions to these new words. Again, that's acquiring content in a vacuum. It's not making this content come alive or doing anything meaningful with it. So we want them to acquire content, but that is not enough. What we want them to do after they acquire that content is what we call apply the content, or content application. And so this is where we have a whole series of strategies and skills that focus on making students use what they've read, what they've analyzed, what they've acquired in multiple ways for multiple purposes. And again, this is where Bloom's taxonomy comes in, or the depth of knowledge scale comes in. But we're asking students to take that primary source document, for example, the Mayflower Compact, and then compare it to, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, or compare it to the Magna Carta, or compare it to some other important document, or compare it to that particular time period, or what its meaning is, or why it's so important, what is its significance. So we're asking students to do a variety of things with the content. And again, AP teachers love the fact that teachers at the lower levels getting kids ready for advanced placement do this in a variety of ways, because that's exactly what they have to do at the AP level. And so by allowing students to experience this and practice this in lower grade levels, by the time they get into an advanced placement social studies course, the teacher can spend more time now delving into the content and getting the students better prepared for that national examination. So that's content application. So number one, we want them to acquire content somehow, some way. We're asking them to do something with it. And then finally, we want them to do what we call content exposition. And this is having them write about it, present something about it, do something with it, so that it reflects what content they've acquired and how they have applied it and how they've used it. And what we're saying here is it doesn't necessarily have to be a research paper, a 5-paragraph essay, or a page-long summary. We have a number of strategies that we call quick writes, and where we're asking students to quickly put themselves in the position of somebody at that time period, or what is their perspective on this, or how would you write an invitation for somebody to attend this event. And so what we're asking them to do is to demonstrate that they understand the content and that they've applied it. So this is a very good formative and summative assessment tool. And again, I'll just say this: the research says on writing that writing is nothing more than a reflection of critical thinking. So it is essential that we get students to write as much as possible. So all of our strategies and methods that we use focuses on that. Students are going to be engaged in writing because it is a way that we can see whether or not they're mastering the skills that we're asking them to do. The other thing is it prepares them for the rigor of an advanced placement course because we're asking them to do many of the things that they will be required to do at the AP level. So there you have the 3 steps, if you will. So every instructional strategy, every lesson, if you will, is going to involve these 3 elements. And by doing that, the rigor is there, and the level of excellence, the level of success is going to rise. And so now what I'd like to do is kind of give you 3 examples of what I mean by this, 3 specific examples. And these are 3 strategies that you can take back with you and use in your classroom this week, tomorrow, if you'd like. The first one is based on content acquisition. And we call this one 3D, using documents to dig for definitions. So thus the title 3D. You've got to have an acronym for something. But again, our focus, we really believe in the importance and the value of powerful vocabulary because it's obviously used by all social studies teachers. But we want vocabulary to be understood, or words to be understood, by using this particular method. And so I'd like to walk you through that method and see how it is powerful and it is rigorous and gets students to really understand the meaning of key terms and concepts and how they're utilized. And this comes from some of the research done by the National Reading Panel on vocabulary. And of course, they're major proponents of making sure that students are exposed to vocabulary and these words and using them in a variety of ways as often as possible. And so I've just listed a couple of their findings here, but they're big advocates of varied vocabulary instruction. And so we have several vocabulary strategies that we teach to our teachers. The number one strategy that most social studies teachers use, and we've all been taught that, is here, find the list of words that the students are going to be having difficulty with, and have them, they're usually in the glossary in the back of the book, or have them look them up in a dictionary, and there they have the words, and then as they're reading the text or doing some other activity, they can look at that word and use it as a reference. That the National Reading Panel says is not that effective. As you look at number 5 here, what they advocate is vocabulary learning that involves active engagement and goes beyond just understanding the definition, and a frequent use of vocabulary strategies. And they believe that will strengthen the reading capability of a student. And if doing so, obviously, the better that a student is able to read and understand text, the more they're able to do rigorous work. So vocabulary is an important foundational teaching skill and strategy for our program. So that's where the idea comes from. So here's the strategy. Rather than have the students look up the word, we're going to have them look at a textual stimulus and then a visual stimulus. By textual stimulus, it could be an excerpt from a book like this. It could be a primary source document, a letter, diary, journal, some important legislation, chart, graph, or map. And what it does is it utilizes the vocabulary word, but it does not provide the word itself. So here what we have is an excerpt from a story called The Chauffeur's Diary. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds, just quickly read that, and then we'll move on to the visual stimulus. So go ahead and read that passage. Okay. So it's basically a little article about somebody driving somebody around. And now here's a visual stimulus. And so I think most of you are probably realizing what the word is that we want them to define. It's not so easy for the students, however. And the other thing I want to remind everybody as well, too, is that this activity is easily differentiated for different levels of students. For example, if I have a class where students have difficulty reading on grade level, I may provide them with more visual stimulus clues as opposed to textual clues, or I may provide them with more textual clues as well. But it's still rigorous, and I still want them to engage in the activity. I'm not going to give them the definition. I'm just going to give them more stimuli, if you will. So then we give them this 3D template. And I've filled this in for you. This is what a student, by the way, this is a 6th, 7th grade activity in the social studies. And I'm asking them to define the word chauffeur. And so what they do is the students would be in a group. They'd be working together on this. And they would look at that textual stimulus, and they would look at that visual stimulus. And then I want them to collaborate and write down what clues that they see that would help them define or understand what a chauffeur is. So the textual clues, the students here wrote that they had to study maps of streets, probably what a chauffeur has to do because they have to know their way around, driving around people for hire, and also in this case, the student mentioned here that they got a bad tip. Okay, that happens. And then the visual clues, it's simply a well-dressed gentleman with white gloves and opening the back door to a very nice-looking car. Okay, so now we're asking them, what is a chauffeur? Now again, they could easily look this up in a dictionary or in the glossary, but I would not expect them to be as successful in being able to apply this definition of chauffeur later on or down the road when perhaps we have to come back and revisit this or revisit a concept that is similar to this. This is a very good activity where students are exposed to visual and textual documents, and then they're able to glean important conceptual information from it. And this is a typical example of that. Let me give you a historical example on the next slide. This is a 10th grade U.S. history teacher who was teaching a unit on the 1920s, the return to normalcy, if you will, and obviously one of the big concerns during that 1920s was the fear that communism was infiltrating the United States. The Bolshevik Revolution, our failure to join the League of Nations, and other factors as well, and the rise of labor unions that had occurred too, and many people believing that labor unions were nothing more than communist fronts. And so Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, in a letter, indicates his view of the communist menace, if you will, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to read this primary source document. And now we're going to have the students take a look at a visual stimulus. And this was a political cartoon that appeared in 1920 in the Chicago Tribune. And obviously one of the preliminary activities that we do at the beginning of the year with our students when we're going to engage them in these types of activities is we spend a few days at the outset of the year showing them how to analyze documents, how to analyze cartoons, how they're going to be used, so that they get into a habit of when they see a primary source document, they know what to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. As a matter of fact, we talk a lot about vertical alignment in our training, and so that a 6th grader is going to be given the same steps, the same technique to analyze primary source material that the 12th grader is going to use in a more sophisticated class. The AP teachers love that, because then when they hand out primary source material in their program, students already know what to do and how to work with that material. So that's another aspect of injecting rigor into our classrooms. In all the districts that we work with, we want them to adapt one method of analyzing documents. Now, there are many out there. We're not advocating a certain one, although we do have a couple of favorites that we advocate. But whatever that method is, stick with it and use it. I give the analogy that we as students, when we were growing up, we learned a particular way to add, subtract, divide, and multiply. We still use that method today. Maybe not so much now as with calculators, but why would we want to make our students in social studies learn how to analyze a document 15 or 20 different ways? It confuses them. It's just like if we were trying to teach a student to multiply, add, subtract, divide in a variety of methods. I don't see a lot of the value in that in terms of promoting in-depth thinking and more rigorous study. But anyways, here's the visual cartoon of A. Mitchell Palmer walking down the street, the Bolsheviks, the beards, and the Reds. And so now what we're asking them to do is to take the template, and the term here is Red Scare, and then we want them to define that term. And so what they would do is, again, in groups, they would go back and take a look at what clues in there helps them understand what a Red Scare was. And now they're actually reading this, and they're thinking about the term in its context at the time it was written and how certain people saw that. And then, of course, they're looking at it visually as well, too. And so now they're going to come up with a definition. And again, you could go to a glossary and say the Red Scare was time period in the 1920s when there was a fear of communism in America. Okay, but now by doing it this way, they understand that perhaps it might have been some paranoia or too much fear. Was the fear justified? Was it true? What was actually happening? And then we can revisit this Red Scare when we get to the time period of the 1950s, when we start talking about the Cold War, as opposed to just having a flat definition that we're going to test the kids on this particular unit and they'll never see that term again. That's why we believe that this is a pretty valuable strategy to use. So that's content acquisition with vocabulary. But if you notice, just doing that activity, we had them acquire content through reading and examining documents. We had them applying it by by analyzing it and writing down clues, and then we had them writing a definition. And so all three activities, acquisition, application, and exposition, were applied in this particular case. That's pretty rigorous. And if students can do that, they're going to be successful. So that's content acquisition. The next strategy is what is called ESPN, and this falls into the content application area, where we want them to do something with the information. So many times we want them to compare primary source documents, multiple documents. We want them to support evidence. We want them to come up with some inference or some predictions about how an event or a law would impact on society. And the way they can do that is through this activity, which is just a knockoff on the sports station ESPN. It's also a knockoff on some of the other classification models that are out there that a lot of social studies teachers use, in which they get students to classify info. But this is our ESPN template, and we're going to have them look at a series of primary source documents, and they are going to then look at those, and they're going to respond to this topic. How did Americans support the war effort on the home front during World War I? Now, a teacher could easily stand up there and say, here's how Americans did this, and list a bunch of information. But again, we want students to get actively engaged with the documents and find out for themselves. And so we're going to give them this template, and we're going to tell them, look, obviously the war effort impacted the home life economically, socially, politically, environmentally. So we want them to find examples of that and draw some conclusions and some predictions on it. Now, in order to do that, they're going to need some support to start out. And so, again, in our early training with teachers and students, we give them what we call the ESPN support chart, where we make a list of the 4 classifications, the categories, and then we provide some examples of what would fall into that. And then we'd like to get them to understand that sometimes a particular document may contain several categories. A document may contain information that's economic or social or political, or all 4 or 2 of the 4. And here again, to differentiate struggling students, we may simply ask them to please find 1 economic or 1 social. For students who are more advanced, we may say that this document contains all 4. Find as many as you can. And so again, there are ways to engage all levels of students in this rigorous activity. But this is something that students need to have ahead of time and need to practice with a little bit before they're able to jump headlong into this activity. So we're taking a look at, in this lesson, the home front during World War I. And so here you have a magazine or newspaper advertisement that advertising a movie that's going to appear at the Alamo, and it's entitled "The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin," and students are going to read through this, and in their groups they're going to understand and teach each other what it means or what it's saying, and then they're going to take a look at this support chart, and they're going to say, okay, so how did this impact the home front, and how did we support the home front economically, politically, and socially? And so what they're going to find is that, for example, okay, people attended the local movie theater, and movies were a form of entertainment back in the in the early 1900s, and this was where they could form particular opinions about Germany. And so the movie industry used the theater to shape public opinion with regard to that. And so they go back to the categories and they try to see, okay, where does that fit? And how can we relate that? And so they might look at leisure time and recreation, that the leisure time and recreation for a lot of people spent at movies was getting them to understand the war effort and why they should support the United States in the war effort against the Germans in World War I, or some other particular aspects of that. Another example, of course, we're familiar with these, and there's plenty of these resources out there. The one on the left-hand side about rationing food. And so, this is one where this poster from the U.S. Food Administration could hit the economic category, could hit the political category, could hit social category, and also could hit environmental categories if you stop and think about everything that's contained in here. It did impact on farming. Well, that's environmental. It did impact on the cost of food. It did impact on how families spent their time together at home when they did have meals together. And then, of course, the one on the right-hand side is supporting the purchase of war bonds to support the war effort. And again, the students will be able to relate this to these categories. Here's a photograph of an all-girls school, and they're building a victory garden. And again, I think you see the, how this can apply. So lots of uses, but notice just in this little activity right here, the students have been exposed to 5 primary source documents, which we want them to be exposed to as often as possible. And again, they've acquired content, and they've applied it in a particular way, and also they've had to write about it. They've had to classify it in terms of information. So they've used all 3 skill sets in that particular activity. And finally, the last one is content exposition, and this is where we want them to write about information. And here's an activity, and I'm going to go through this rather quickly with you because I see we're running out of time, but this is an activity about eminent domain, and this activity involves geography and civics. So quickly read this page, and then I'll flip it to the next page about this particular problem that we're going to have the students engaged in. Okay? And by the way, the third paragraph, the average cost of farmland was $2,700 an acre. That's pretty cheap price, $2,700 for all of the land. So really what we have here is a little problem where we're going to ask the students to take a position of a commissioner that has to make a recommendation to the state as to whether or not this farmland should be seized under eminent domain, and the state should build this highway. Okay, so they've got this written explanation, but also now I want to give them a visual stimulus as well. So here is the visual stimulus, which basically summarizes in a picture what they had just read about. So there you see the farmland in the middle, you see the smaller town in the lower right-hand corner, the big city in the upper-hand corner, and you see the roads and the distance that it takes to get to these particular communities. Now, we have to understand something, that all of our students who come into our social studies class, we'd like them to be, we'd like them to love our subject the most. But unfortunately, some students like math and some students like science. And so what we did here was we integrated both math and science into this social studies activity. Math students will see immediately the right-hand triangle where they see the proposed highway cutting at a diagonal through this person's property, and they're going to use the Pythagorean theorem to figure out just exactly how long that distance is. Science kids are going to take a look at the environmental aspects of this problem in terms of the lake and the scenic route, if you will. And then they have this decision to make about whether or not they should take this person's land. If you took a poll immediately after reading the article, the students will almost unanimously say, you can't do it, it's not fair, that's the person's land, they paid for it, it's their livelihood, and they'll give you lots of good, rational reasons why that land should not be taken. However, what we want them to do is we want them to step into the shoes of some other people. And so we give them this, what we call the way I see it, and we give them what we call a talk bubble, and I'll show that to you in a moment. And we want them to take the position of some member of the community, and they're going to play that role. And what we'd like them to do is to include a reason why the person should or should not have their land taken. And so that, they're going to be able to define eminent domain when this is over, but they're actually going to discuss whether or not the land should be taken. And here are the various roles that they can play. And you can assign several to students, one to a student. There's various ways that this can be constructed and implemented. But what they're going to find out is how to view things from different perspectives. And so as they get into AP courses, a lot of times they're going to be asked to take, to provide evidence of what perspectives were there and why those perspectives were taken when they should on particular issues. And so we're planning students to do that. And so that's the activity that we call the way I see it. And so those are the three activities. And again, if you'll notice on that one, we're having them acquire content. They read the story, they looked at the diagram, and now we're asking them to apply it by taking the role of a particular person, and then they have to write what that position is. And so there you have it. That's rigor. And I appreciate your time. And there's my information if you want to get a hold of me to find out anything more about the program and about getting kids ready for advanced placement courses. I thank you for your time and good evening.
Thanks so much, Dale. So if any of you have a question or a comment, if you use the dashboard on your right-hand side of the screen under chat, you can send Dale a question or post a comment. We'll be glad to read this. Oh, thank you. Let's see. Dale, do you want to take a look at that chat comment there?
I'm trying to find it.
Okay.
Okay, yes. Can everybody hear me?
I think so, yes.
Okay. The question is, while looking at the Red Scare vocabulary, you mentioned vertical alignment for analyzing primary source documents. What are some vertical alignment techniques that you find are the most successful? Okay, so, vertical alignment or vertical teaming has many different aspects to it. So it depends on what aspect of vertical alignment or vertical teaming are you that you're referring to. When we talk about vertical alignment, we're talking about a certain set of skills that we have identified that we implement at all different levels. And so these strategies, for example, the vocabulary acquisition strategy that we call 3D, we're having 6th graders do it as well as 12th graders do it. The difference is the level of sophistication and the level of complexity. And so as they go through their school years, 6 through 12, they get better at doing this and practicing this activity so that they can be exposed to more complicated material. The other thing too is we're big on what we call directives in vertical alignment. Directives has to deal with writing. One of the things that we find, and I think you find too, is that students know how to write. They do. They know how to write. It's just that they don't know what to write about, and because they're not taught the directives. And by directive, I mean a prompt or a word that instructs them as to what to do. For example, analyze. I've asked students, what does analyze mean? And they don't know. I've asked students to evaluate something. I've asked students to summarize. I've asked students to project or predict. And so these are directives that we have in writing that students are going to be exposed to at much higher levels. And so what we're doing, what we want them to do is to practice applying those directives. And the directives that we give our kids on a vertical alignment basis are those directives that they would get in an AP course. So beginning in 6th grade, we expect our students to be able to apply. We expect our students to be able to analyze. We expect our students to be able to evaluate. And we have activities that enable them to do that. AP teachers love us for doing that because they're going to get, a number of students who are able to enumerate, able to list, able to make a judgment and prefer. So that's another technique that we use. The other thing is, in terms of our another vertical alignment technique that's very successful, is the type of formative assessments that we provide. By formative assessment, I'm talking about the unit exam. And we make sure that the format, the structure of all of the formative assessments or exams, if you will, in a social studies 6 through 12 program are the same formatted questions, and that they are visually, that they're provided with a visual stimulus and a textual stimulus. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the College Board, in its recent redesign in the social studies, has moved towards that. Particularly the multiple choice area, that's all students are getting now. Is they're getting a visual stimulus question, they have to respond to it. They're getting a textual stimulus question, they have to respond to that. So that's another technique that we use. You could look at, so we're looking at it in terms of classroom instruction and strategy implementation. There are other ways of looking at vertical alignment as well too. You might, for example, I've done vertical team meetings with districts where, okay, at 6th grade, how many times should they be using the 3D strategy? How many times should they be using that strategy in 7th grade, 8th grade? And so there are discussions on that, and that's a different kind of vertical articulation and vertical structure. We're saying that there's a set of social studies skills that all students should be exposed to and should practice regularly, grade 6 through grade 12, that the skill, the strategy is the same, it's just the sophistication that changes. And I hope I answered your question.